The sun was falling low over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in deep orange and gold. The wind carried a fine dust that clung to everything: clothes, hair, skin, even memories. Near the riverbank, where the water ran slow and clear, a woman bent down to rinse a pile of worn clothes. Her name was Taya, an Apache woman who once had laughter bright enough to fill the mountains. But life had taken much from her, leaving behind only silence and work. She lived alone on the edge of a small frontier town, in a small cabin made from dry logs and patched cloth. People in town barely spoke to her. Some said she was strange. Others said she was cursed. They whispered that no man wanted her because she could never bear children. A healer had told her long ago that her body was too big in some way, not built for carrying life. Those words cut her deeper than any knife could. Among her tribe, a woman who could not bring new life was treated like a shadow. Among the settlers, she was seen as nothing more than a worker who did laundry for a few coins. So she kept her head down and did what she knew best: survive. That afternoon, as she worked by the river, she heard the slow steps of a horse. The sound made her heart tense for a moment. Often men on horses came only to mock or throw words sharper than stones. But when she turned, she saw a man she hadn't seen before. He was tall, quiet, dressed in a dusty brown coat and hat that had seen too many summers. His horse looked tired but well cared for. The man's name was Luke Carson, a cowboy known for keeping to himself. He didn't drink much, didn't talk much, and didn't laugh like the others at the saloon. He had eyes that carried both kindness and sadness at the same time. Luke stopped his horse near the water and nodded politely. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said softly. His voice was deep but calm, the kind that didn't mean any harm. Taya didn't reply. She just nodded back and kept washing the clothes. She didn't trust easily. She had seen too many faces that looked kind at first but turned cruel later. Luke dismounted, letting his horse drink from the river. The wind blew gently, carrying the scent of wet earth. For a while, neither of them spoke. Only the sounds of water and wind filled the space between them. After a few minutes, Luke picked up a stick and began drawing lines in the dirt with his boot. "This water's cleaner than most places I've seen," he said, as if talking to himself. "Guess that's why you come here." Taya didn't look up, but something in his tone told her he wasn't trying to pry. He was just making gentle talk. "It's quiet here," she finally said. Her voice was low and rough, like someone who had forgotten how to use it. He smiled a little. "Quiet's good," he replied. "World makes too much noise." That was the first time she looked at him properly. His face wasn't handsome in the usual way. It was rough, tanned, marked by sun and work. But his eyes were kind. She saw no judgment in them, only a tired honesty. Still, she didn't let herself think much about it. People came and went. Kindness never stayed long in her life. Over the next few weeks, she began to notice him around town. He often came to the general store for supplies. Sometimes he'd stop by the river again, always keeping a polite distance. One morning when she arrived to wash clothes, she found a small paper bag resting on a flat rock. Inside were a few apples and a pair of gloves, strong ones, better than the torn pair she'd been using. No name, no message. But she knew who had left them. Taya looked around the quiet riverbank, feeling the strange warmth of being remembered. She told herself it was just pity. Still, she kept the gloves. Her fingers fit perfectly inside them. Weeks turned into months. The cowboy kept showing up, not every day, but often enough that she began to expect it. Sometimes he'd bring her small things, a bit of flour, a tin cup, even a worn-out book with large letters. He never asked for anything in return. Sometimes he would just sit by the river, fixing his saddle while she worked. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was easy, it felt. Safe, but the town didn't see it that way. One hot afternoon, when Taya went to deliver clean laundry, two women standing by the store began whispering loud enough for her to hear. "That Apache woman thinks she's a lady now," one said with a laugh. "She's got that cowboy hanging around her like a lost puppy." The other woman smirked. "He'll come to his senses soon enough. Men like him always do." Taya lowered her eyes, holding the laundry tight against her chest, trying to walk away. But just then, Luke came out of the store holding a bag of feed. He heard every word. For a second, the whole street went quiet. Luke looked at the women, calm but firm. "You don't kick dust on someone who's already had enough of it," he said. His voice was steady, but his eyes were sharp. The women turned red and looked away. Taya froze, her heart beating fast. No one had ever stood up for her before. Not since her mother died. Not since the day she was told she'd never be a wife or mother. She didn't know what to say. When Luke walked past her, he tipped his hat slightly and said, "Evenin', ma'am." Then he went on his way as if nothing had happened. That night, Taya sat by her small fire, thinking of what he'd done. For years she had believed she was invisible, just a worker, a body that moved through the world unseen. But Luke had seen her, not out of pity, not out of charity, but because he believed she deserved respect. The thought filled her chest with something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The next morning when Luke came to the river, Taya surprised herself. She spoke first. "You shouldn't have done that yesterday," she said quietly as she scrubbed a shirt on the rock. "They'll start talking about you now." He shrugged. "Let 'em talk," he said simply. "I don't live for their mouths." She couldn't help it. A small smile tugged at her lips. "You talk too much for a quiet man," she said, teasing lightly. He laughed, the sound low and real. "Guess I only talk when it's worth it." For the first time in years, Taya laughed too. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make the birds nearby lift their heads. That small sound broke the wall she'd built around her heart. From that day on, they talked more. About the weather, the cattle, the stars, even about dreams. Luke never asked about her past. He seemed to understand that some wounds didn't need to be reopened. One evening, when the sun turned the river gold, Luke told her he'd be heading north for a few weeks to move cattle. Taya tried not to show disappointment, but it showed in her eyes. "You'll come back?" she asked softly. "Only a fool wouldn't," he said with a half-smile. "You make this river look peaceful." She didn't know how to reply, so she looked away. But her heart felt strange, like something alive was waking up again inside her. When he rode away the next morning, she stood by the river longer than usual, watching the dust rise behind his horse until it vanished. In the days that followed, she realized how much his quiet company had changed her world. The river seemed lonelier. The town felt colder, yet she caught herself smiling sometimes, remembering his words. Deep inside, she feared she was letting her heart hope for something she could never have: love, marriage, a family. But even that small hope made her feel alive again. When Luke finally returned weeks later, tired and sunburned but smiling, he found Taya at the river, washing clothes as always. She looked up and couldn't hide her joy. "You came back," she said softly. "Didn't I promise?" He replied, and for the first time when their eyes met, there was no wall of silence or fear between them. Just two hearts that had both been hurt and had quietly begun to heal in each other's presence. The days grew warmer as summer spread over the Arizona plains. The grass near the river turned dry and gold, and dust hung in the air like a soft fog. Taya still washed clothes by the river every morning, but now there was something new in her routine. She would glance toward the horizon, waiting for a small shape of a man and horse to appear. It wasn't that she depended on him. She simply liked the quiet comfort of knowing that Luke Carson might stop by, say a few kind words, and remind her that not everyone in the world looked down on her. Luke did come. Not every day, but often enough to make her heart notice. He brought supplies sometimes: flour, beans, coffee, or little things she needed for her cabin. He never made her feel small for taking them. If she tried to pay, he would shake his head and say, "Just call it a favor from one hard worker to another." One morning, as the sun climbed high, she found him sitting under a cottonwood tree near the river, fixing his saddle strap. She smiled faintly and went about her work. After a few minutes, Luke said, "You ever get tired of washing other folks' dirt?" Taya looked up, her hands in the water. "Work keeps me strong," she said. "Better than sitting and remembering." Luke nodded slowly. "That's true," he said. "Work saved more souls than whiskey ever did." The two shared a quiet laugh. Taya noticed how his laughter sounded, deep, gentle, and rare, like a sound that had been missing for too long. She didn't ask why he laughed so little. She knew what it felt like to keep pain buried inside. Sometimes they talked about small things: how the river had more fish this year, or how coyotes cried louder during full moons. But other times silence spoke louder than words. Luke would sit by the fire after sunset, and Taya would hand him a cup of coffee. They didn't need to talk much. The company itself was enough. One afternoon, Taya walked into town carrying a basket of washed clothes. A group of ranch hands stood outside the store laughing loudly. When they saw her, the laughter turned cruel. One of them, a tall man with a red beard, said loudly, "There goes the woman who thinks she's too proud for men but not proud enough to say no to handouts." The others laughed. Taya kept walking, her heart pounding, eyes fixed on the ground. Before she could reach the store door, Luke appeared from inside, carrying a sack of feed on his shoulder. He stopped when he heard the men. His eyes hardened. "You boys done talking like fools?" he asked, his voice quiet but strong. The laughter stopped. The red-bearded man tried to grin. "We're just talking, Luke, no harm done." Luke set the feed sack down slowly. "Talking's one thing," he said. "But when you use it to make someone feel small, it becomes something else." His tone wasn't angry, but there was steel in it. The men looked at each other, uncomfortable. Luke added, "She works harder than any of you. Maybe you should try that for a change." The street went silent. Taya stood frozen, unsure what to do. For the first time in her life, someone had spoken for her. Not with pity, but with respect. When Luke turned to her, he said softly, "You all right, ma'am?" She nodded, unable to find words. He lifted the feed sack again and walked beside her to the edge of town, saying nothing more. The silence between them carried more meaning than words ever could. That evening, she waited by her cabin fire. When she saw him riding toward her, she felt both nervous and grateful. "You shouldn't have done that," she said quietly as he tied his horse near her fence. "Done what?" he asked. "Spoken for me. People will talk about you now." Luke smiled slightly. "They already do," he said.
"Let 'em."
"They get tired eventually." Taya shook her head, but there was a hint of a smile on her lips. "You don't belong here," she said softly. "You're kind in a place that doesn't know kindness." He looked at her with calm eyes. "Maybe I belong wherever I find someone worth being kind to." Those words stayed with her long after he left that night. She sat by her fire watching the flames dance and felt something inside her shift. For years she had told herself that love wasn't meant for her, that her life was already written and all she had to do was live it quietly. But Luke's presence made her question that. He didn't treat her like someone broken. He treated her like a person who still had worth. The next morning she found a small paper on her doorstep. It wasn't a letter, just a few words written in a shaky hand. "If you ever need help fixing your roof, I'm around." She folded the paper carefully and tucked it inside a jar. For the next few days, every time she looked at her cabin roof, cracked and sagging, she thought of those words. Finally, one evening, she decided to ask. When Luke arrived at the river the next day, she said shyly, "You meant what you wrote?" He smiled. "Always do." They spent that afternoon fixing the roof. He worked quietly, hammering old nails into place while she handed him tools. The sun set behind them, painting the desert sky red and violet. When the work was done, Luke stood back and said, "It won't leak now, not even if the heavens open." Taya laughed softly. "I'll believe that when I see it," he grinned. "Then I guess I'll come back when it rains just to make sure." That promise sounded small, but it warmed her heart. No man had ever promised to come back before, and kept it. Over the next few weeks, their bond grew deeper. Luke began helping her plant a small garden beside her cabin. He brought seeds and tools. She showed him how to build a fence that could keep rabbits out. They worked side by side until their hands were dusty and their backs ached, yet both smiled through the sweat and heat. In the evenings, they sat near the fire watching stars appear one by one. Taya would hum an old Apache song, the one her mother used to sing. Luke listened quietly, never interrupting. Sometimes he would softly whistle along, catching the rhythm. It felt like two worlds meeting under the same sky, her tribe and his lonely cowboy soul. But even peace has shadows. One night, as they shared coffee, Luke's face turned serious. "Taya," he said quietly, "you don't have to thank me for anything. I'm not doing this because I pity you." "I know," she said softly. "You don't look like a man who pities anyone." He gave a faint smile. "Good," he said, "because I've seen pity and it does no one any good." Then, as the fire crackled, Taya asked the question she had been afraid to ask. "Why are you kind to me, Luke? You could talk to any woman in town. Why waste time on someone like me?" Luke looked into the flames for a long moment before speaking. "Because you remind me that good things don't come easy," he said finally. You work hard, you don't complain, and you carry pain like it's just another chore. That kind of strength? It's rare. His words caught her by surprise. No one had ever called her strong before. Most people only saw her as incomplete. A woman who could not bear children. A woman left behind by both worlds. But Luke saw something else entirely. The firelight danced across his face as he added softly, "Sometimes, the Lord gives people heavy burdens so others can see how strong they are." Taya looked at him, her throat tight. She wanted to thank him, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she whispered, "Maybe the Lord sent you here to remind me that I'm not finished yet." Luke smiled, tipping his hat slightly. "Maybe he did," he said. That night when Luke rode back to his ranch, Taya stood by her cabin door, watching his figure fade into the desert darkness. The wind brushed her hair, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel lonely. She felt seen. She felt human again. As days passed, the townsfolk began to notice how the quiet cowboy and the Apache woman worked together, how he always treated her with respect, how she smiled when he was near. Some whispered cruel things, others simply watched in silence. But Taya and Luke didn't let the noise reach them. They had found something stronger than gossip, peace in each other's company. And while neither of them said the word love, they both felt it, growing slowly, like the first green shoots after a long desert drought. The night sky stretched wide above the desert, filled with stars that shimmered like tiny fires. The air was cool and still, carrying the scent of sage and dust. Luke sat by Taya's cabin, watching the flames in the small campfire flicker and dance. He had just returned from a long week of cattle work. His shirt was dusty, his hands rough, but his eyes were calm, the kind of calm that only came when he was near her. Taya handed him a cup of coffee. "You look tired," she said softly. He smiled faintly. "Cows don't sleep much when storms roll in," he said. "But I've seen worse." She sat down across from him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "You always say that," she said with a small smile. "You've seen worse. You've done worse. You've been through worse. Yet you never tell what that worse was." Luke stared into the fire for a long time. The crackling wood filled the silence between them. Then he sighed, setting his cup down slowly. "Maybe it's time I did," he said quietly. Taya looked at him with gentle eyes. She didn't ask questions. She simply waited, like someone who knew the value of silence. "I was married once," Luke began, his voice low, "a long time ago. Her name was Clara. She was soft-spoken, sweet, the kind who made any place feel like home. We lived near a small river, not too far from here. I worked the land, she baked bread, and we dreamed of a family." He paused, his hands tightening slightly. The firelight flickered across his face, showing the pain he had carried for years. "She got pregnant," he continued. "We were so happy. She made baby clothes by hand even before the first month passed. She'd sit by the window every evening talking about names, painting the baby's future with her words. But when the time came," his voice broke a little, "she went into labor early. It lasted 2 days. The doctor came, but there wasn't much he could do. She didn't make it. Neither did the baby." The words hung heavy in the air. Even the fire seemed to quiet down. Taya's eyes softened with deep sadness. She could almost see it. The lonely house, the empty cradle, the silence that must have followed. Luke looked down at his hands. "After that, I sold the farm. Couldn't stand the sight of it. Every wall reminded me of her laughter. Every corner smelled like her bread. I started drifting, taking cattle work wherever it came. I thought if I kept moving, maybe the pain would stay behind. But pain's got long legs, and it follows you everywhere." Taya's throat tightened. She whispered, "I'm sorry, Luke." He gave a small smile.
"Don't be."
"That was years ago. Time dulls the blade, but it doesn't take it away." They sat quietly for a moment. The desert wind brushed through the dry grass, carrying a soft hum of crickets. Then Luke said softly, "Now it's your turn, Taya. What happened to you?" She hesitated. Her hands tightened around her shawl. For years, she had carried her pain like a hidden wound, showing no one. But something in Luke's honesty opened a door inside her heart. "When I was younger," she began, "I was meant to marry a man from my tribe. He was brave, a hunter, proud. Everyone said he would be a good husband. But before we could wed, I fell sick for many weeks. When I recovered, the healer told me my body would never carry a child. He said I was too big inside, not made for motherhood. I didn't understand what that meant, but I saw the look on their faces. To them, I was useless. To the man I was promised to, I was broken. She looked at the fire, her eyes far away. He married another woman. I didn't blame him. But after that, I couldn't stay. My family treated me kindly, but every glance felt heavy. I left, came near this town, and started working. I told myself I didn't need anyone. But her voice trembled softly. There's a kind of silence that grows too loud when you're alone too long. Luke nodded slowly. I know that silence, he said. Taya gave a small, sad smile. I used to think I'd never be more than a worker with empty hands. Then you came along leaving flour and gloves like I mattered. Luke chuckled softly, shaking his head. You do matter, Taya, always did. The world just forgot to tell you. Her eyes glistened in the firelight. And you, she said gently. You carry too much grief on those shoulders. Maybe that's why you came back to the river. Maybe the land brought us together. Two people the world tried to forget. Luke looked at her for a long time. Then, with quiet honesty, he said, Maybe so. They sat side by side, watching the stars above. Neither spoke for a while. The stillness wasn't heavy. It was peaceful, like both their souls were resting for the first time in years. The next day, Luke helped her with the garden again. As he dug into the hard soil, Taya brought him water. They worked quietly, side by side, like two halves of the same story. When the sun began to sink, Luke wiped the sweat from his brow and said, I've been thinking of building a small corral near your place. Keep a few horses here, maybe a cow or two. You could use the milk. Taya looked surprised. You'd do that here? Sure, he said simply. Closer to you means less trouble with the ride. Her heart beat faster, though she didn't say why. People will talk again, she warned. He smiled. Let them. Talk's free, but it doesn't buy happiness. Taya couldn't help but smile. You always have an answer for everything. Not everything, he said quietly. But I know when something feels right. And for him, being near her felt right. More right than anything had since his wife's passing. That evening, they sat by the fire again. Luke played a soft tune on his harmonica, a lonely melody that drifted through the night air. Taya listened, eyes closed, her heart wrapped in the music. When he finished, she whispered, That song sounds like rain in the desert. He smiled. That's what it's called, desert rain. Clara used to hum it when she missed home. Taya's heart softened. She must have been a good woman. She was, Luke said, staring into the fire. But she's gone, and life goes on. He turned toward Taya, his eyes gentle but steady. And maybe I was meant to meet you. Not to replace her, but to remember that love still exists, just in a different shape. Taya looked down, her cheeks warm in the firelight. I don't know if I can love again, Luke, she said softly. Not in the way most people do. I don't have much to give. Luke shook his head. You've got everything that matters. Kindness, strength, patience. That's love, Taya. You don't need to give life to children to give life to someone's heart. Taya felt her chest tighten with emotion. The years of rejection, loneliness, and silent shame began to melt away in the warmth of his words. For the first time, she felt like she wasn't broken, just different. And different could still be beautiful. As the fire burned low, Luke reached out slowly, not to touch her, but to place a small carved wooden bird on the table between them. Made this on the trail, he said quietly. It's rough, but it reminded me of you. Strong wings, gentle eyes. Taya picked it up carefully. The little carving was simple, but beautiful in its own way. You made this? She asked softly. He nodded. Didn't have much else to do while the cattle slept? She held it close, her heart full. Thank you, she whispered. I'll keep it safe. The night grew quiet again. The stars burned brighter, the fire smaller. But something inside them both had changed. A bridge had formed, built not with grand promises or fine words, but with truth, respect, and shared pain. When Luke finally stood to leave, Taya said, Be careful on the trail. He smiled softly. Always am. You take care, Taya. She nodded, holding the little bird close to her heart. As his horse disappeared into the moonlight, she looked up at the sky, whispering a small prayer. Not one of asking him, but of thanks. She thanked the stars for sending her a man who didn't see her as empty, but as enough. That night, for the first time in many years, Taya slept peacefully, not as a woman the world had forgotten, but as someone who had been found. The monsoon season arrived late that year. The sky had turned a heavy shade of gray and the air smelled of rain and wet dust. Luke and Taya stood outside the cabin, watching dark clouds roll across the mountains like waves. The first drops began to fall, slow and soft at first, then turning into steady rain that soaked the ground. Luke smiled and tipped his hat. "Looks like I came back just in time to see if that roof leaks," he said. Taya laughed, remembering his promise. "You and your big words," she teased. "Let's see if your hands were as strong as your talk." They both hurried inside as the rain grew louder, drumming against the roof. For a moment they stood there watching the water run down the windows. Not a single drop leaked through. Luke grinned proudly. "Told you so," he said. Taya shook her head but smiled. "I'll admit you were right," she said softly. They sat near the fire, listening to the rain. The smell of wood smoke mixed with the scent of wet earth, filling the cabin with warmth. Luke leaned back in his chair and said, "Rain always reminds me that things can start fresh even after years of drought." Taya nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Maybe life is the same way. It rains again, even when we think the sky forgot us." Outside, thunder rolled gently in the distance. They shared a peaceful silence, two people who had learned to live again after loss. A few days later, after the rain stopped, Taya went to the river to wash clothes. The water was higher now, flowing fast and cold. As she bent to rinse a blanket, she heard something, a faint cry carried by the wind. At first, she thought it was a bird. But when it came again, sharp and trembling, her heart jumped. She looked around, scanning the trees along the riverbank. Then she saw him, a small boy no more than 6 or 7, sitting under a tree. His clothes were torn and his face was streaked with mud. His dark hair hung over his eyes and his little body shivered from the cold. Taya dropped the blanket and ran to him. "Hey there," she said gently, kneeling down. "It's all right. You're safe now." The boy flinched at first, ready to run, but when she spoke softly in the Apache tongue, he stopped. His wide eyes filled with tears. "Mama," he whispered weakly. Taya's heart broke at the sound. She wrapped him in her shawl and held him close. "It's all right," she said softly. "I've got you. You're not alone." She carried him back to her cabin where Luke was mending a saddle strap. When Luke saw her walking in with the small bundle, he stood quickly. "What happened?" "I found him by the river," Taya said, setting the boy near the fire. "He's cold and hungry." Luke knelt beside the child. "Hey there, buddy," he said gently. "You hurt anywhere?" The boy shook his head, too weak to speak. Taya handed Luke a dry blanket. "He's Apache," she said quietly. "Probably from a camp north of here. Maybe his people were attacked." Luke's jaw tightened. "Poor kid," he said softly. "Let's get him warm first." Taya made soup while Luke helped the boy sip water. The child ate quietly, looking around with frightened eyes. But when he saw Taya smile, he relaxed a little. After eating, he curled up beside the fire and fell asleep. That night, Taya sat beside him, watching him breathe. Luke leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "He's got nobody, does he?" he asked quietly. She shook her head. "Not anymore," she said sadly. "I can tell." Luke sighed. "Then he's got us now," he said simply. Taya looked up at him in surprise. "Us?" Luke smiled gently. "You think I'd let you do this alone?" Her eyes softened. She didn't answer, but her heart did. Over the next few days, the boy slowly began to recover. They learned his name was Nakai, which meant the wanderer. He spoke little, but he followed Taya everywhere, from the river to the garden. He watched how she cooked, how she fed the chickens, how she brushed her long black hair before bed. One afternoon, Luke carved a small wooden horse for him. When he handed it to the boy, Nakai's face lit up for the first time. He held it close and smiled shyly. "Thank you," he whispered. Luke ruffled his hair. "You're welcome, partner," he said. Taya watched them with quiet joy. Something inside her stirred, something she had buried long ago. She had believed she could never be a mother, but caring for this lost child filled that empty place in her heart in ways she couldn't explain. At night, when Nakai couldn't sleep, Taya would sing soft Apache songs. Luke often listened from the porch, the music wrapping around the cabin like a gentle blanket. Sometimes the boy would crawl between them by the fire, resting his head on Taya's lap while Luke told quiet stories about cattle drives and starlit trails. The cabin that once echoed with silence now carried laughter. Small, fragile laughter that made everything brighter. One morning, Luke found Nakai trying to help him feed the horses. The boy struggled to lift a bucket of oats, spilling half of it. Luke chuckled. Easy there, champ. These fellas eat a lot, but not that much. Nakai laughed, his small hands covered in grain. Taya stood by the fence smiling. It felt like a family scene, simple and beautiful. Later that day, a few townsfolk passed by on their way to the next ranch. They saw the three of them together, the cowboy, the Apache woman, and the little boy. One of the men whispered, "Strange sight, ain't it?" The other replied, "Yeah, but looks like they're happy." Luke heard them but said nothing. He just looked at Taya and Nakai and thought to himself, they can think what they want. Happiness doesn't need permission. That evening, the three of them shared supper by the fire. Nakai talked more now, asking Luke questions about horses and trails. "Will you teach me to ride one day?" he asked eagerly. Luke smiled. "Of course I will. But only if your mama says yes." Taya looked up, startled. The word mama hung in the air like a soft bell. Nakai turned to her with wide eyes and asked, "Can I call you that?" Her heart swelled with emotion. For a moment she couldn't speak. Then she reached out and brushed the boy's hair back. "If it makes you happy," she said softly, "then yes." The boy grinned and hugged her tightly. Luke turned away, pretending to stir the fire. But there was a smile on his face, too. That night, as the wind blew gently through the cottonwoods, Taya stood outside with Luke. The stars were bright above the desert. "He called me Mama," she said quietly, almost in disbelief. Luke nodded, his voice soft. "Because you are, Taya. Not all mothers give birth. Some are chosen by the heart." Her eyes filled with tears. "I never thought I'd hear that word," she whispered. Luke looked at her with warmth. "Maybe that's why God brought him here. Not just for him, but for you too." They stood in silence for a moment, feeling the night wrap around them. Inside the cabin, Nakai slept peacefully by the fire, the wooden horse clutched in his hand. Taya looked up at Luke. "You've given me more than you know," she said softly. He smiled, shaking his head. "No, Taya, you gave me more. You showed me that love doesn't end. It just changes shape." As the stars shimmered above, the three of them, the cowboy, the woman once shunned, and the boy who had lost everything, had found something rare in that lonely stretch of desert. A family made not by blood, but by kindness and choice. From that day on, the people in town stopped calling her the strange Apache woman. They began to call her the woman with the cowboy and the boy, and to Taya, that was more than enough. Years passed, and the Arizona desert changed with the seasons. The small cabin that once stood quiet and lonely now looked full of life. The garden beside it bloomed with beans, corn, and flowers that Taya loved. The fence Luke built was stronger than ever, and the little corral behind the cabin now had 2 horses and a milk cow. The sound of laughter often filled the air, a kind of laughter that only comes from peace. Nakai had grown taller. His dark hair reached his shoulders, and his smile was brighter than the desert sun. He followed Luke everywhere, learning how to ride, how to tie a rope, how to fix saddles, and how to be honest no matter what. When he wasn't with Luke, he stayed near Taya, helping her plant seeds or cook. To anyone who visited, it looked like a real family, and in every way that mattered, it was. One morning, Luke stood outside, watching Nakai ride the horse he had trained himself. The boy's posture was strong, his hands steady on the reins. "He's got a good hand," Luke said with pride. "Learns fast," Taya smiled from the porch. "He had a good teacher," she said softly. Luke chuckled. "He had too," he said, glancing at her. "You taught him to listen before he speaks. That's worth more than all my lessons." She laughed, brushing her hands on her apron. The warmth between them was quiet but deep, the kind of bond that needed no words. As time went on, the people in town grew used to seeing them together. Some who had once gossiped now came to their cabin for help. Maybe a small favor, a meal, or just a bit of advice. Taya treated everyone kindly, no matter who they were. Luke noticed that her gentleness softened even the hardest folks. One afternoon, an old rancher came to them for medicine for his wife. Taya gave him herbs and showed him how to brew them. Before leaving, the old man said, "You've got a good woman, Luke. She's got more heart than this whole town." Luke smiled proudly. "I know," he said. Life moved on in its quiet rhythm. Every sunrise felt like a gift, and every sunset a promise. Sometimes Luke still thought about his first wife, Clara. But when he looked at Taya, strong, calm, and full of kindness, He understood that love didn't fade. It simply found new soil to grow in. One winter, a heavy cold swept through the valley. The air turned sharp and snow covered the hills, a rare sight in their part of Arizona. Luke caught a fever after working too long in the storm. Taya stayed by his side, keeping him warm with blankets and herbal tea. Nakai fetched water and wood, refusing to leave his father's side. For 3 days, Luke drifted in and out of sleep. Once he opened his eyes and saw Taya sitting beside him, holding his hand. "Still here?" He whispered weakly. "Always," she said softly. "You once told me you wouldn't leave." "I gave you the same promise." He smiled faintly and closed his eyes again. When he finally woke fully, the fever had passed. Taya smiled in relief, whispering a prayer of thanks. "You scared us," she said quietly. Luke reached for her hand. "Guess the good Lord decided he still needs me around," he said, smiling weakly. "You're needed here too," she replied gently. "By me, by Nakai." That winter tested them, but it also brought them closer than ever. When spring finally came, the valley came alive again. Wildflowers painting the hills, rivers running strong, and laughter echoing across their land. One morning, as they sat outside watching the sunrise, Luke said, "You know, Taya, when I first came to this place, I thought I was just passing through. I never planned to stay, but now, I can't imagine leaving." She looked at him, her dark eyes warm. "You found home," she said softly. He nodded. "I did. And I found more than that." He reached for her hand. For a moment they sat quietly, their fingers entwined. The years had left lines on their faces, but their hearts were lighter than ever. As time went on, Nakai became known in nearby towns as a fine young man, honest, skilled, and respectful. He often said, "Everything I know I learned from my parents." The word parents made Taya's heart full every time she heard it. One afternoon, when Nakai was about 16, a trader stopped by their cabin. He looked surprised to see the boy. "Is that your son, Luke?" he asked. Luke smiled proudly. "He's ours," he said. "That's all that matters." The trader nodded. "Good-looking boy, strong. Takes after you, I reckon." Luke glanced at Taya, who stood by the garden, the sunlight touching her hair. "He takes after her," he said softly. "She's the strong one." Years continued to pass gently. The boy became a man. The cowboy grew older, and the woman who once believed she was cursed now stood as the heart of a family. Their cabin became a place of welcome. Travelers stopped for water, neighbors came for advice, and sometimes children from the nearby settlement would visit to play near the river. One evening, as the sky turned red with sunset, Taya sat by the door sewing a blanket. Luke walked up slowly, his steps heavier with age. He sat beside her, watching the horizon. "Remember the first time I came by that river?" he said, smiling faintly. She laughed softly. "I remember thinking you were just another man passing through." "And I remember thinking you were the strongest woman I'd ever seen," he replied. "I was right," she smiled, setting her needle down. "You stayed," she said gently. "When everyone else left, you stayed." He nodded, his eyes warm. "You gave me a reason to. You gave me a home again." They sat together, watching the last light fade. The air was cool and still, filled with the quiet hum of crickets. Inside, Nakai was preparing supper, humming an old Apache tune, the same one Taya used to sing when he was a frightened child. Luke smiled, hearing it. "He sings your song," he said. "He sings our song," Taya replied. "It belongs to all of us now." That night, as they sat around the fire, Luke looked at Nakai and said, "You're ready to build your own life now, son. Maybe find some land, start your own herd." Nakai smiled. "I will," he said. "But I'll never be far. This will always be home." Luke nodded proudly. Taya reached over and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "We'll always be here," she said, waiting. In the years that followed, Nakai built a small ranch nearby. He married a kind woman from another tribe, and soon the sound of children filled the air again, laughter echoing across the valley. Every week he came to visit Luke and Taya, bringing food, stories, and joy. The family that once had nothing now had generations that carried their love forward. When Luke's hair turned white, he often sat on the porch, watching the sun rise over the same river where he had first met Taya. Sometimes he would smile to himself and whisper, "Still no leaks in that roof." And every time Taya would laugh and reply, "You're still proud of that roof after all these years?" He would grin and say, "It's the best thing I ever built, next to this life." As time gently carried them toward old age, their love never faded. It only grew softer, deeper, and more peaceful. Luke's hands became shaky, but Taya always helped him saddle the horse, even if it was just to ride a few steps near the cabin. He still called her ma'am sometimes, just to make her smile, and every night before sleeping, they held hands like they had done for years, no words needed, just the quiet comfort of knowing they had walked through life together. One calm evening, when the desert wind whispered softly through the cottonwoods, Luke sat watching the sunset with Taya beside him. He turned to her and said, "If I had to live my life again, I'd still ride into that town, still stop by that river, and still find you there." She smiled, her eyes shining with tears. "And I'd still pick up that basket," she said, "just so you'd have a reason to stop." They both laughed softly, their laughter blending with the wind. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in gold and crimson, the same colors that had filled their first evening together years ago. The world had changed, but their hearts had not. The cowboy who had lost everything found peace in the arms of an Apache woman who had once thought she was unworthy of love. Together they built a life not measured by blood or children, but by kindness, strength, and the love they gave to others. And when the wind moved through the desert at night, it carried their story, the story of Luke, Taya, and Nakai, a story of how love can bloom even in the driest places, and how two broken souls can make a family strong enough to last forever.